What's going on, everyone? So I am super excited today because a lot of you have been requesting this, and more specifically for me to talk about the new Palpatine leader, which I did a little bit, but we're actually diving into fully all the leaders today and ranking them on a preliminary tier list. This is with very basic testing. I've only been able to play a few games against people and a bunch of games against AI, but of course not testing all the combinations, and it's just one person and all that stuff. But we're going to be ranking them in terms of what I view their viability will be. Now, when we did this for set 2, we were actually pretty on the mark. I put New Han and I put Kira in my S tier, which are some of the most well-performing set 2 leaders that we have. I also put Jabba up there, which I would put him in like the B tier as of now. So there are definitely some places that I got wrong. So we're not saying that I'm going to be absolutely 100% correct here, but I do think that I have at least some opinions about where I think these should go. And I know some people will disagree with me because it already has happened in one of my previous videos about set 3. Before we get started, big thank you to my patrons over on Patreon. Thank you for supporting the channel. It really does help out. Love chatting with all of you, and I love getting in some games, and I'm excited to test some set 3 decks against you all. Second thing, I have a TCG player link in the description down below. Be sure to use it for any of your Star Wars Unlimited card needs, and of course, if you wanted to go ahead and pick up any boxes for set 3, be sure to use that link. But let's talk about the tiers first and what they mean, and then let's dive into our first leaders. So let's start off with the S tier. These leaders, and I don't think there's going to be more than like 1 or 2 in the S tier, are leaders that I view as potentially meta changing. These are leaders that are like New Han and Kira, who could take some top 8s in planetary qualifiers and potentially win some. These are those types of leaders. A tier are going to be the leaders that are kind of runner-ups up to that and definitely could take some top 8 planetary spots, or just leaders that are going to kind of be solid, and you'll see very consistently throughout the meta popping up as just really good contenders. B tier leaders, these are leaders that are going to show up every once in a while. These are like your Kylo yellows, your Jabba yellows of the world. These are leaders that have some potential, have some support, but I don't think are going to be immensely powerful. C tier leaders are things that maybe you could bring to your showdowns and your Friday nights and maybe pick up some games here and there or take something down there, but definitely not competitive anyway. Maybe just don't really have a clear-cut advantage over a lot of the other leaders that we have in the game now, or just maybe don't have a very good ability for what we're doing in Star Wars Unlimited. And D tier leaders, these are leaders that I see as like, absolute garbage. Like, your ability does basically nothing, and I don't think you're gonna see them do anything. These are like Hera leaders, right? Not like they're gonna be absolutely Hera tier, because Hera is really bad, but leaders that are gonna be not that strong. So let's start us off with our first one. So we're gonna start off with the Vigilance leaders first up, and well, I know we're going to have some disagreements right off the bat. We first got to start off with Nala Se. Now, when I first talked about her, I consider her more of like a Hera tier leader. I think she's, as I said in that video, like a lot better than Hera, but I don't think she's going to amount to much. She also has a very similar ability, this ability to ignore aspect penalty on clone units. There's actually not that many clone units that you really want to be playing, okay? And I know some people were considering, oh, well, you could play like Tech in your Vigilance villainy control deck. Tech doesn't really do a whole lot, and that's one of the most appealing clones to play in Vigilance villainy. It doesn't really offer a whole lot outside of the control mirror matchups, and even then your opponent can remove it oftentimes, and there's not really that many clones that, again, you want to be playing alongside your Vigilance villainy control units. She deploys for 4, which is interesting, and she gives you this kind of interesting ability, but it doesn't really do a whole lot because your clone units, well, have to die, and they have to die when Nala Se's around, and you have to have clone units period on the board, which isn't really something that Vigilance villainy tends to do in the early stages of the game, is deploy a bunch of clone units to the board. I just don't really see her doing that much. If she had a little bit of extra power on her flip side as like a 2/7 instead of 1/7, maybe something there, or maybe like Restore 2 or something there, I could see some value. I don't see her doing all that much, and I don't see her providing basically any value realistically to many decks. So Gonna be in a C tier, for me. Next up, we got Newt Gunray. So Newt Gunray is very interesting. He's one that I've played with a lot. He kind of just goes into the exploit deck. His action doesn't really do a whole lot unless you are exploiting things out. This one's a little bit tricky. I'm going to start him off in the B tier, but I think he's like a low B tier, maybe like a high C tier. There's a couple of things that I think are nice with Newt Gunray. The first thing is he deploys at 6 resources as a 2/8, so he's probably not going to die. And he generates a body for you to continuously exploit things out. He also regenerates kind of the fodder for exploiting, right? You play 2 units, you exploit something big, you get to recoup one of those units by using the action from Newt Gunray. Here's the downsides, and there are a lot of them. One, he requires a lot of actions, right? Any exploit deck is going to require a lot of actions because you both have to, well, play the units, then to exploit. And then after you exploit, you have to use Newt Gunray's action. If you want to attack with units, you have to do that as well before you exploit them, right? All of which are very big downsides. Also, there are things like Waylay, Fell the Dragon, Rivals Fall, all of which absolutely destroy exploit decks, okay? So depending on how you're going to go about things, I think depending on the deck, you could see this doing a little bit of work. Again, I think this is like low B tier, maybe even high C tier. I might adjust these as we go further into the list. And I think Newt Gunray is a little bit sketchy. I think exploit, again, against like Sabine Green, for example, is really good. It's really, really good because Sabine Green doesn't have ways to deal with massive units that you get on the board very quickly. Another deck that is probably good against is basically any deck that's not playing Cunning and not playing Waylays, right? Any deck that's not playing like your hard removal options, so Vigilance, so any Vigilance or Cunning decks, you're going to struggle. Any decks that aren't running those combinations or aren't running the cards that are dealing with the big units, I think Newt Gunray is going to do a good amount of work. But that's a lot of the field, okay, to be bad against. Boba Yellow, going to eat Newt Gunray alive. Let's say that much. Next up, we got Obi-Wan Kenobi. Kind of an interesting leader. He's got the heal. I'm laughing because I saw a lot of people really excited about Obi-Wan. Like, this leader is so insane. I actually think this guy is pretty weak. I think when we saw Obi-Wan, I mentioned he was like average to like below average. As one of the first leaders that we saw, he does have that sentinel body when you flip him around. This action to heal 1 damage, it takes actions. It's not going to be that valuable. This to me is like C tier, maybe even D tier level. And I hate to say that about one of the coolest characters in Star Wars, but this is just like, I don't think you're going to get any value out of this heal. I don't think the sentinel body that you deploy on 6 is going to amount to a whole lot. Not to mention you're in Vigilance villainy, Vigilance heroism, which is oftentimes just worse than Vigilance villainy for controlling purposes, which is what this deck kind of wants to fall under. There's not enough good sentinels compared to villainy to really take advantage of Obi-Wan. Honestly, I'm going to put him at like C tier. I think he's like on the same level of Nala Se. I'm just putting Nala Se a little bit higher because I know some people are really excited about her. And we're talking, hey, I think you're wrong on Nala Se. So I gave a little bit of credit for you all just as a preliminary precaution. But I think Obi-Wan is pretty bad. And you're going to have to find some sort of value out of getting that 6 resource play, getting Obi-Wan down and getting some value going there or something. I don't know. Next up, we got Yoda. And I'll say this much, guys. I mentioned this is like one of the most broken leaders from set 3, and I'm still on that board. He literally is going into S tier. I think this is one of the leaders that actually could put Vigilance, Heroism, more soft control, hard control decks on the map. He is extremely strong. The ability to discard a card when you're coming down and kill something, anything on the board because of his setup on the front side is really powerful. And this is one of those things where it just gives you so much value when he does flip and actually makes the 7 resources to get him to get those 7 resources and then flip them actually worthwhile. I could see like an A tier argument, but to me, this is one of the most incredible looking leaders from set 3. And I think that there is really, really nice options for anyone who's looking to play a more controlling heroism deck now with Yoda, with like Hello there, with some other options that you've got like Sentinels and things, but most importantly, Yoda as a leader. Getting the card filtering can be relevant. It is action intensive, but again, action intensity doesn't matter nearly as much to more controlling decks because of you just removing their units, right? And you're probably going to be reactive most of the time, so your opponent does actually have a good chance of taking the initiative in a lot of these situations. So I think Yoda's going to be one of the best leaders from set 3, and I think he has the potential to be one of the meta leaders. Next up, we can dive into the command leaders. So starting us off, we've got ourselves a brand new exploit leader, which I also think is extremely strong, and that is Count Dooku. Now, I would put him into the S tier, but as I said, I think that the S tier is really limited to 1 to 2 leaders that I think are going to be the key leaders, and I think there's one other leader that I'm more excited about on this list, and we'll get to him later on. Ooh, spoiler, him. But Count Dooku is actually a contender for that S tier. When I was looking through the leaders that I think are the best, I had to test these 3, Count Dooku along with the 2 in S tier, a lot more to figure out which one I viewed as a little bit stronger. Count Dooku is amazing, and if there were more Separatist cards, I think Count Dooku could be an S tier leader. The biggest problem holding back Count Dooku is the fact that there are not enough Separatist cards to really create this deck where you're exploiting something out extremely powerful and have many options every point of the game. You are putting him into an exploit shell, but the things that you're exploiting out, well, for one, only sacrifice 1 unit, and they're only marginally expensive to the point where you could play them for, honestly, their regular cost, but they are cards that are regular costed. Like, for example, what's a good one? The Separatist Bodyguard, or like the Battle Droid Escort, for example, even like fodder pieces. These are 1 cost resource units now with Count Dooku. These are cards that don't normally have exploit. And so what happens is they aren't tuned to a point where they're costed for their stat line or for what they're doing. Like, for example, Hailfire. That card is just a stat stick and it's overcost for what it's trying to do. This allows you to cheat on costs for cards that are on par with what you should be getting for their cost. And that's what makes Count Dooku a lot stronger. The problem is that you don't have enough Separatist cards. And that's the biggest problem. The other portion of it is that he's 7 to deploy and doesn't give you anything nearly that strong as like Yoda, for example, when he deploys. And also people can deal with your exploited units out. If you are kind of using these fodder pieces to generate more value, you can go ahead and get messed up by potentially removal options and things like that. The next command leader we're going to talk about is Wat Tambor. This is a pretty interesting one. I think he has some potential. Basically, he's kind of like an exploit leader where you're trying to exploit stuff out, but he's more of like an aggro-focused exploit leader, which is a little bit weird. He has a very weird deck building constraint. I would put him at the higher end of B tier, maybe even like the low A tier. I could see him doing some decent work. The problem with him is you're trying to have units that are dying, but then you also need to have units that can get that +2/+2 after that unit was defeated to go ahead and either attack their base or value train. It's a really tough thing to do to get valuable units that you are able to close out the game with while also having units that die frequently. You can also just curve out as him, but that's a lot less exciting and a lot less powerful. In that case, I would very much rather pick other options, and that's what kind of makes me put him into the B tier. He's also very action intensive, and that can be a big downside when you're giving a temporary buff for a phase. Next up, we've got Captain Rex. This is an interesting one. He comes with a token, and that's not something I can say with any leader in the entire game. When you deploy him, you get that 2/2 Clone Trooper token, which is kind of interesting, gives you an extra dynamic to the leader deployment. His front side action, I've played a lot of Captain Rex. I played double green, I played green red, I've played green yellow, I've played green blue. I love Captain Rex as a character, so I wanted to make him work. I've been really unimpressed with Captain Rex. I'm actually going to put him at the top end of C tier. So his front side action, the 2 resources associated with it is just way too expensive just to get a 2/2. Way too expensive just to get a 2/2. If you're at a point where you've run out of cards in hand, you can use this action as just extra value, you've probably already lost the game. if you do deploy him and you get that 2/2 out, the nice thing about him is that he pumps up all your other kind of units that ideally if you're building your deck around it with extra toughness, which can be impactful, but he's also just a 2/6, right? And that 2/2, it doesn't come in ready. So it's not like you get 4 damage when he comes down. So he ends up being not that strong of an aggressive leader, despite him kind of being an aggressive, value-oriented leader. I just really have found him to be deeply unimpressive. And the last command leader we've got is Padme Amidala. Guys, I'm not going to waste any time. This is an immediate D tier for me. There are just so many things. Even if this was literally just action, exhaust, search the top 3 cards for a public card, and put it into your hand, I wouldn't think that this leader would be higher than like B tier. Even without the coordinate and the resource cost, right? Because you're searching for a Republic card, and you're also limited by the fact that you can't actually pay for all these cards in your hand, and also it's action intensive. Add to the fact that you need to pay a resource, okay? That's already a big downside. And then you also need to already have 3 units on the battlefield to use this action. The payoff just isn't good. It's just not good. This is such a terrible, terrible ability on the front side, and you're not even getting like that amazing of a flip side. As I mentioned previously with Padme, one of the big things that I thought could maybe give her some value was something to kind of stall out the game, but she only has Restore 1, whereas Krennic, for example, has Restore 2. That actually ends up being pretty impactful. Restore 1 is massively less impactful. So to me, this is a pretty weak card, weak leader, and basically unplayable. Next up, we dive into the aggression leader, starting us off with Maul. You might have seen me put out a video with Maul just the other day. I was pretty excited about trying him out because you could do the triple Maul thing where you play 3 Mauls in your deck, and that's pretty sweet. And also, he is the highest power leader that we have in the game as of when he comes down, right? That is really, really cool. His front sight action, however, just ends up being meh, because you don't find a spot, and by the way, I'm going to put him at like the middle of B tier. You don't really find many situations where you're able to overwhelm through if you're trying to aggro yourself out, right? Or curve out and aggro your opponent down. Your opponent's units are going to match your own, and if they don't have units, then you don't need to overwhelm and use this action anyways. When we get to the flip side, let's say you wanted to ramp into higher, more powered units. Well, great. You're ramping, but you can sometimes get overwhelmed with damage because he comes down on 6, which is a hard thing to do and deal with. And then on top of that, he's not extremely tanky, and you don't have any front side action to help you get to that point, right? If you look at some of the other mid-ranged leaders that are ramping and getting some value, you have things like Han Solo, New Han. You have things like Boba Fett. And what do these leaders do? They either accelerate you to the point where you can get things down, or they give you some way to recuperate resources in the early game, like Boba Fett, or they come down a turn earlier. In Han and Boba's case, it's both on 5 resources. The nice thing about Maul, and this is the big bonus, is that he really works well with things that pay you off for having specific things that associate with Maul. For example, the Force Tag. Another example is just having high power for Overwhelming Barrage. That's the best thing that I've seen with Maul, is getting Maul down after ramping, playing an Overwhelming Barrage, and getting an 8 power Overwhelming Barrage to absolutely annihilate your opponent's board. But the other thing that you have to keep in mind is he sizes up really poorly against things like Poe Dameron, against things like Wrecker, which can all be ECL'd out. And he also just really, really doesn't offer you all that much outside of just being a 6/6 when he comes down. So kind of average. Next up, we got Pre Vizsla. And I know a lot of people are excited about this one as well. I was a little bit like, oh, this could be potentially interesting, but I'm not 100% sure yet. There are some cool things you can do with him. There are a lot of events in the game that say like search the top cards and then draw them, which allows you to deal some damage to units, which can be pretty cool. He also comes down as a 5 resource 4/6, which can be pretty nice. And if you do have a bunch of cards in your hand, you do get a powerful leader as he comes down. Here's the problem with it. This action does not make up for all the time you're wasting by drawing cards. Okay, The thing that I think is the most exciting is him being like a 5 resource, extremely high powered leader without any sort of, downside. That's the thing that I'm most excited about it. After having the 5 cards in hand, you can get a very, very high powered leader when he comes down, and he does come down on 5, which can be nice. But that's going to only happen if you're either not playing things in the early turns or you're drawing cards, which is not playing things in the early turns. And that can just allow you to be overwhelmed massively quick. I think that if you compare this guy to something like a Bosk, or you compare him to some of the other aggression villainy leaders that we have, I think he doesn't look that great. And the only thing that he really has going for him is a 5 resource 4/6. So I'm going to put him into the C tier. Not exactly all that exciting. Next up, we got Ahsoka Tano, which is an interesting one because she revolves around the coordinate ability. And a lot of our leaders kind of just have this like pay resource or do something in the game, have a unit die. Ahsoka is specifically associated with coordinate. Now, she's an aggression heroism leader, which is in the same category as Sabine. So anytime you look at Ahsoka, you immediately have to compare her to Sabine, as that is in the aspects, and she is an aggro leader. Ahsoka, I actually think she has some promising options. I'm actually going to put her at the higher end of B tier. The thing that I've realized with Ahsoka is I don't really care about the front side action. There are some situations, if I play like Ahsoka Yellow, where you can go like Cartel Turncoat turn 1, and then turn 2, you go like unit, and you get to coordinate attack with some damage. Or you like go like Millennium Falcon, and suddenly you have a really powerful aggro start, right? The thing that I'm more excited about is her flip side, and getting her down as a 5/6 and having like Ahsoka's lightsaber on 5 resources. Like that is where she becomes pretty powerful. However, coordinate is something that's very difficult to set up, and the coordinate units that we have are very, very mediocre. So to me, coordinate really is the key as to whether Ahsoka is going to be really good or not. That's why she's in the B tier. I think she's going to somewhat be a card or a leader that you're like, I could bring in a Store Showdowns and like my weekly F&Ms or whatever, Star Wars Unlimited, but they're not going to be competitive because there's just too many decks that can deal with all the units that you're deploying, and you're just not going to get any value, and you're not going to get the direct damage that Sabine does, and you're not going to get the 4 resource deploy. Next up, we've got Anakin Skywalker. Now, I was pretty excited about Anakin as I first revealed him, and I'm actually still reasonably excited for him, especially with some of the units that we've gotten, but also just him as a leader on the flip side, right? He technically, I mentioned this earlier with Maul, as well as pre-Vizsla, I guess, can compare to Maul in terms of stat line with having similar power if there's enough damage on your base. But I think the most exciting thing about this is that it's an aggro deck that has a little bit more dimension than like a Sabine. I think that's what makes him a little bit more interesting for me. He fits more of in a mid-range style of deck. And I'm actually going to put him, I can't quite put him in the A tier. And I think our list is going to be a little bit lopsided here, but I'm going to put him at the top of B tier for now. This is a character or a leader that allows your aggro deck to go ahead and punch up into things like Chilled Sins and things like that brick wall you, but doesn't actually give you the direct damage to overwhelm your opponent and get in massive chunks of damage. It's also very poor in an aggro matchup because you're dealing 2 damage to yourself just to trade with an opponent's unit. And that is pretty weak. He also comes down a little bit later. So I think there's some things that are really cool about him, like punching up into units and then coming down and him being like a 7/7, right? Which is not super uncommon. But he also has some big negatives, and that can harm him. I'm going to put him at the top of B tier because I'm not quite sure where to put him with such a unique ability. Next up, we've got Mace Windu, yet another character that has this action to deal some damage to damaged units, or another resource intense action, but this one allows you to deal damage to damaged units. I think what's interesting about this one is we have a lot of aggression heroism leaders now because Ahsoka was the starter deck, and that gave us another aggression heroism leader for this set. So we have kind of a +1, but we also have some really promising ones already in New Han and Sabine Wren. I guess not promising, but staples as like just super strong ones. So when I'm looking at these ones, they have to be pretty good and they have to kind of match what you want to be doing. And I don't think Mace Windu matches what you want to be doing. At the very least, Anakin and Ahsoka do what you want to be doing in aggression heroism. But Mace Windu is kind of like this value oriented, like it kind of wants to go in a soft control, hard control shell where you get this value where you can damage your opponent's units and slowly ping them down. He also comes down on 7 resources, which is a little bit absurd, right? As a 5/8, that gives you like this little mini bombing run, not even bombing, like blood sport for damage units. Like it just doesn't really do a whole lot, in my opinion. I think this is a leader that I could see being in the D tier. It's kind of sad because if Padme could have her own tier, I would put her in her own tier. She's like F tier. Okay. Mace Windu, not nearly as bad as Padme, but he's on that kind of same level where I don't see him doing basically anything. And then we got to talk about some of our cunning options here. The first one we got is Asajj Ventress. Now, she's kind of an interesting one. She is a 4 to deploy leader, which immediately is like, okay, can we do something with her being a 3/4 on 4 resources? She has this interesting thing where you kind of have to build your deck where you have to have a lot of events, but you also have to have units to take advantage of those events. And that can be a little bit tricky. Now, she does have the cool ability where you can go ahead and like surprise strike her for 7 points of damage and first strike something down. She does have the option of getting in a lot of damage with things like surprise strike shoot first that are intended to deal a bunch of damage with her action, and the surprise strike, you can do a lot of damage in a single turn. The problem I see is that she's kind of like a one trick in that you need to rush your opponent down, and that's going to be really inconsistent. She kind of reminds me of like a Kylo Ren. She's going to come down if your opponent can deal with her. She's going to be really, really poor. And on top of that, you need to have the right units followed up by the right events in order to get value from her. So she's a little bit swingy, but I think she ends up in the lower end of B tier because of her potential aggressive start. She's also competing against Boba Fett, and that's something that you don't want to be doing. Next up, I'm going to talk about General Grievous, another starter deck. Again, the Cunning Villainy leaders, unfortunately, also have a starter deck in them, so they have to compete against Boba Fett, and there's a lot of them, and it's gonna be hard to compete against Boba Fett. But General Grievous here does look pretty interesting. He gives you this guaranteed Sentinel if you have a droid unit, assuming you can use this action. You have a 4/8 body when he flips over for 6 resources, which is a little bit above average. But let me just get this straight. I don't think he's good, and the main reason is you are restricted to droid units, and there are not enough good droid units for General Grievous to do a whole lot. And for him to deploy on 6 resources of 4/8, I just don't think that's good enough. Unlike Ahsoka or Anakin, which I think do have some potential upside against like a Sabine deck, I don't see General Grievous doing anything for you that Boba Fett won't do better. And for me, he is going to be like a C tier, maybe even I'm actually going to just put him into D tier. He reminds me of like a Chewbacca, which is already bad, but there's just not enough droid units to where I think General Grievous is going to do anything. Like, I just don't think General Grievous is all that strong. I was pretty excited about him because I was hoping that there's going to be enough droids where General Grievous is like coming in and he's going to be smacking people down, but I don't think General Grievous is all that great. Next up, we got Jango Fett, and I know people were really high on Jango Fett, and I was not one that was so, and I'm still that way, guys. I do not think Jango Fett is very good. I did make a mistake in my initial review of him. For some reason, I misread the Twitter post about Overwhelming Barrage, and I made a false comparison in that video, but you can use things like Overwhelming Barrage on the flip side in order to exhaust a whole array of opponents' units. But let me just say this. For one, he's a weaker stat line to Boba Fett. He's in the same aspects as Boba Fett. That's a huge thing counting against him. He doesn't have an angle over Boba Fett because Boba Fett is a better tempo leader in terms of leveraging additional resources to progress your board, to put on pressure, rather than leveraging your resources or using your resources, not even leveraging resources, because you're not going to have extra runs because you're not going to ready them like Boba Fett can, but using your resources to exhaust your opponent's units by using direct damage abilities or trying to attack them to stun them for a turn. It's just not that strong. The extra power that you don't have is really, really unfortunate that it's missing. I just don't see this guy doing a whole lot. I'm gonna have to put him in like the C tier category. I think he's pretty unlikely to show up. But I mentioned earlier that we have another S tier leader, and that's gonna be now Chancellor Palpatine. Guys, I have been playing with Chancellor Palpatine a lot. He is a leader that I was extremely excited to see, and I cannot wait to show you all. I think I'll post the video tomorrow of just some preliminary testing with some AI. Again, not like amazing guarantee that it's going to be amazing, but I will say there are all these leaders. I have tested all of them in some AI games, and some of them are initially promising and some of them are just initially not promising, and that's where some of these ratings are. Chancellor Palpatine, the value you get is insane. So the front side, a heroism unit has to be defeated in order to draw a card and heal 2 damage. Okay, that's kind of a little bit of a restriction. The flip side is just to play a villainy card, which is really not that big of a deal. And then when you do so, you get a clone trooper token. And you're probably not going to have the initiative, which means your opponent's going to have the initiative, and they're probably not going to immediately kill your clone trooper token, because if they do so after you flip Palpatine, you probably are able to take the initiative, and then you can kind of change things up. And that means that your clone trooper token can die, right, after you flip Palpatine from villainy side to heroism side, which would then next turn allows you to go ahead and let that clone trooper token die, as I mentioned, and then flip back to the villainy side, which is amazing. The healing is really relevant. The drawing extra cards ends up being pretty powerful because you're in a deck that is split aspects. And because of the heroism villainy, you do want more cards so that you don't have as much inconsistency. So the drawing of cards actually does help out a lot. And then what the best part about this is you get that villainy side. So you get the healing, you get the clone trooper tokens to stall out the game and do some nasty stuff. And then you get the villainy side to close out the game and to give you some powerful sentinels, which can be really, really cool. So between all of that, I see this guy being a really, really powerful cunning control leader, which is really, really interesting. So I'm pretty excited about that. The deck building constraints on this guy and what you can do is immense. You have essentially 4 aspects to choose from. And one of those aspects being like a split down the middle, right? Splitting the heroism and villainy cards. So you have so many cards to choose from, which makes this guy really tough to build around. I've personally have found Vigilance to be a really strong combination with him because of things like Power of the Dark Side, for example, that allows you to flip back into good Palp mode. Oh my gosh, I've just been really excited about him. And the last leader of today we got to talk about is Quinlan Voss. And I think he's going to end up somewhere around like the middle of B tier. He is a little bit weird. So if he said cost the same or less than on the front side, I would be a little bit more excited then for this unit. The problem here is you must play a unit that costs the exact same as your opponent. So this forces you to go ahead and play on the back end. And what I mean by that is your opponent has to be in the position where they have initiative. Otherwise, you'll never go ahead and get that damage in the turn that unit comes down. It will have to come afterwards. On the flip side, you're able to deal to units that cost less than, which is kind of interesting. He's also a 5 resource, 3/7 force unit, which can be kind of interesting. The Republic tag I found to be pretty weak. The Force tag, you have like Ahsoka, which I think fits a little bit better anyways in what the Force decks want to be doing. But overall, this ability is going to get a little bit of value here and there. But to be honest, how many times is 1 damage going to really change a unit combat? I'm not sure if it's really going to be all that much. Realistically, one of the things that I do like about him, though, and that's the part of the reason why he's in B tier, is his deploy sign. that ability to deal some extra damage to units that are cost the same or less than is actually decent. And him being a 3/7 force unit on flip is actually quite nice. So I do like that about Quinlan Voss, but I'm not super excited about his overall abilities and such. But that is going to be the set 3 leader tier list. I know some people are just going to disagree. I know some people think, Nala Say is like an A tier leader, or Yoda is absolute trash. I know how many people commented on that Yoda video that I said was like going to be the most broken leader from set 3. I know a lot of you are like, you're clickbaiting and all this stuff. I truly believe that he is one of the most broken leaders, and as of that moment, the most broken leader that we had seen in set 3. And I stand by that here today, and we'll see if I'm right or wrong. I could be wrong, very much so, but we will see going forward. I think he has some of the most promising options. Alongside him, Chancellor Palpatine, if you've played with this leader, you will start to see how potentially strong he can be in some matchups. Count Dooku has a lot of options. Separatist cards holding him back a little bit. In the B tier, we got a lot of different leaders. Unfortunately, I think this is where there's a big distinction. Like, you have a couple leaders that are really strong looking, and then a lot of middling leaders to kind of pour. I think overall, set 3 leaders are looking a little bit weaker than set 2 and set 1 leaders, but we will have to see overall. I think one leader that could potentially surprise me is Asajj, depending on how that deck is formulated. Another that could be potentially surprising is Newt, depending on how the meta shakes up. But if cards like Yoda and Chancellor Palpatine are good, then Newt Gunray and Count Dooku are not going to be good, because those cards are controlling, and their whole point is to remove all the things off your battlefield. And with Chancellor Palpatine's case, he's going to have that recurring clone trooper token, which can take out multiple droid trooper tokens, and that can be pretty bad. So we'll see how all these leaders shape up. Let me know what your top leaders are in the comment section down below, and whether or not you agree with my list. Again, totally fair if you think I'm completely wrong, but this is just my list going into set 3. Thanks for watching, everyone. Hope to see you tomorrow for another video. As I said, I should have that Chancellor Palpatine video up and running by that point. But for that, I'll say see you tomorrow.